There is an eye inside you that has never blinked. It has been open since before you were born, and it will remain open long after the eyes in your face have closed for the last time. Most people live and die without ever knowing it exists. They spend their entire lives looking outward, searching for meaning in faces, in mirrors, in the flickering light of screens, never once turning inward, to the one place where the truth was waiting all along. What if I told you that a man born 800 years ago in the Muslim West, in a small town in Spain, discovered the location of that eye, and left behind a map so detailed, so dangerous in its implications, that entire generations of scholars still argue about what he really meant? His name was Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, and they called him Al-Shaykh Al-Akbar, the greatest master. And the teaching he left behind was not a set of rules or rituals. It was a key to something hidden inside the human chest, something so subtle that most religious teachers were afraid to even speak its name aloud. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand why some people call this the most dangerous secret in the history of mysticism, and why others call it the most liberating truth a human being can ever receive. Let me take you back to the year 1165, to a house in Murcia, in the region we now call Andalusia. A child is born into a family of some standing, a family with connections to scholars and rulers. Nothing about his early life suggests what is coming. He grows up, he studies, he seems destined for an ordinary life of comfort and status. And then something happens. Something that biographers have struggled to fully explain, because Ibn Arabi himself often spoke about it only in riddles. He falls gravely ill. Some accounts say it happened in his youth, a fever so severe that he hovered at the edge of death. And in that space between life and death, something in him cracked open. He would later describe an encounter, not with a doctor, not with a family member, but with three prophetic figures who visited him in that state between waking and dying. Jesus, Moses, and Muhammad, peace be upon them, standing at his side, calling him back to life, calling him toward a path he had not yet chosen for himself. When he recovered, he was not the same person. He abandoned the comfortable trajectory that had been laid out for him and threw himself entirely into the world of the spirit. He sought out teachers, many of them women, remarkable female mystics whose names history has almost erased. Women like Fatima bint al-Muthanna of Cordoba, a saint so advanced in her spiritual station that Ibn Arabi would later say he served her as a son serves a mother, and that he had never seen anyone more devoted to the unseen than her. He traveled across Andalusia and North Africa, sitting at the feet of hermits, scholars, and unlettered saints alike, absorbing everything, testing everything against his own inner experience. And slowly, a teaching began to crystallize in him. Not a teaching he invented, he would insist, but one he received. He always claimed that his greatest works were not composed by his own intellect, but poured into him, dictated to him in states of unveiling that he called kashf, a word that means, quite literally, the removal of a veil. And this brings us to the center of everything Ibn Arabi came to teach, the veil, because according to him, and according to the entire current of Sufi thought that flows through him, the problem of human life is not that the truth is hidden somewhere far away, in some distant heaven, in some unreachable dimension. The problem is that the truth is right here, pressed up against your face, and yet you cannot see it, because there is a veil over your eyes, not the eyes in your skull. Those eyes see quite well. They can read these words, recognize faces, judge distances, avoid obstacles, but there is another eye, buried deeper, an eye that Ibn Arabi and the mystics before him called the eye of the heart, al-Qalb, sometimes called basera, inner insight, inner vision. The faculty by which a human being perceives realities that have no color, no shape, no location in physical space, and yet are more real, more solid, more permanent than anything the physical eyes will ever behold. Now pause here for a moment and ask yourself something honestly. Have you ever had a moment, just a flash, where you understood something not through reasoning, not through someone explaining it to you, but through a sudden inner certainty that arrived from nowhere and settled into your chest, like a stone dropping into still water? Maybe it was a moment of grief, when suddenly you understood, not intellectually but completely, that everything in this world is passing. Maybe it was a moment of love when you looked at another human being and felt, for one unrepeatable second, that you were looking at something eternal wearing a temporary face. That flash, that momentary opening, is what Ibn Arabi spent his entire life trying to describe, stabilize, and teach others how to access at will rather than by accident. Because for him, this was not a rare gift reserved for a spiritual elite. This was the birthright of every single human being, buried under layers of forgetfulness, distraction, and attachment to the outer senses. To understand why he believed this, we have to go into the Arabic word for heart itself, Qalb. Ibn Arabi, like many mystics before him, loved to unpack the root meanings of words, because he believed language itself was a kind of scripture, encoded with divine wisdom whether people noticed it or not. The root of Qalb is qalaba, which means to turn, to flip, to overturn, to fluctuate. The heart, in this understanding, is not a fixed organ of stubborn belief. It is something that turns, something that flips from state to state, moment to moment, depending on what it faces, depending on what it reflects. And this is the first and most important image Ibn Arabi gives us for understanding the inner eye. The heart is a mirror, not a fixed painting, not a photograph. A mirror, a living, breathing, ever-turning mirror, capable of reflecting the entire cosmos, capable of reflecting the divine names themselves, but only if it is polished, only if it is turned in the right direction, and only if nothing stands between it and what it is meant to reflect. Think about what a mirror does when it is covered in dust and grime. Does it stop being a mirror? No. Its essential capacity to reflect remains completely intact underneath all that dirt. It simply cannot express that capacity because of what has accumulated on its surface. This, for Ibn Arabi, is the exact condition of the human heart in its ordinary, unawakened state. It is not that we lack the capacity for inner vision. It is that our hearts have become caked with layers of dust. What is this dust made of? According to the teaching, it is made of heedlessness, of attachment to fleeting pleasures, of excessive love for status and possession, of anger, of envy, of the endless chatter of the mind that never rests, of the ego's constant insistence that it is the center of the universe. Every single one of these things settles onto the mirror of the heart like dust settling onto glass, layer after layer, year after year, until a person can look directly at the most profound realities of existence and see absolutely nothing, because their inner mirror has gone completely opaque. And here is where the teaching becomes both beautiful and, honestly, a little bit terrifying, because it means that most human beings are walking around blind without knowing they are blind. They believe they are seeing reality clearly through their five senses and their rational mind, when in fact they are seeing only a fraction, a surface, a shadow of what is actually there. Ibn Arabi was fond of quoting and expanding upon a verse from the Quran that describes certain people as having hearts with which they do not understand, and eyes with which they do not see. Notice the phrasing. It does not say they lack hearts or eyes. It says they have them. And yet those organs fail to function as they were designed to function, because they have been buried under the accumulated weight of a life lived only for the outer world. So then the natural question becomes, how does one clean this mirror? How does one open this inner eye that has been shut for so long that most people forget it was ever meant to open at all? This is where Ibn Arabi's teaching becomes intensely practical. Even though it is wrapped in some of the most complex metaphysical language ever produced in the history of religious thought, the first and most essential practice, according to him and according to the entire Sufi tradition he represents, is dhikr, remembrance. Not merely repeating words with the tongue, though that is where it begins for most people, but a remembrance that gradually moves from the tongue to the mind, and from the mind down into the very chest, until the remembrance becomes constant, effortless. A kind of background hum that never stops, whether a person is speaking, working, eating, or sleeping. Ibn Arabi described the heart as something that literally cannot bear to be empty. It will always be filled with something. If it is not filled with remembrance of the divine, it will be filled with remembrance of the world, with anxieties about the future, with replayed grievances from the past, with fantasies, with cravings. And every one of these fillings acts like another layer of dust on the mirror. Dhikr, true dhikr, is the slow, patient, repetitive act of polishing that mirror, stroke by stroke, until what was covered begins, very gradually, to become visible again. This is not a quick process. Ibn Arabi never promised instant enlightenment. He spoke of years, sometimes decades, of consistent inner work, work that had to be done under the guidance of someone who had already walked the path, because a person cannot polish a mirror they cannot see. And in the beginning, most seekers cannot see their own hearts clearly enough to know what needs polishing and what does not. But dhikr alone, in his teaching, is not sufficient. There is a second element that runs alongside it, and this is where Ibn Arabi's teaching becomes genuinely revolutionary, especially for the era in which he lived. He insisted that the heart cannot be polished while it remains attached to things that do not deserve its devotion. He used a striking image, describing the heart as a house, and asking, quite bluntly, how can a house hold two masters at once? If a person's heart is filled with love for wealth, for reputation, for the approval of others, for their own image of themselves, then there is simply no room left inside that house for the reality he called al-Haq, the real, the ultimate truth that some call God. some call the absolute, some call the ground of being itself. The heart has to be emptied of these lesser attachments, not because they are inherently evil, but because they occupy space, and that space is needed for something infinitely greater. Now here is where we arrive at the concept that made Ibn Arabi both immortal and in his own time deeply controversial, the concept known as Wahdat al-Wujud, usually translated as the unity of being. Though Ibn Arabi himself never actually used this precise phrase in his own writings, it was a term later scholars used to summarize his teaching, sometimes accurately, sometimes crudely. Here is the essence of it, stripped of academic jargon. Ibn Arabi taught that there is only one true reality of existence. Everything that appears to exist separately, the trees, the mountains, the animals, the stars, you, me, every single form we perceive with our physical senses is not a separate, independent thing possessing its own existence. Rather, every single form is a reflection, a manifestation, a mirror image of the one true reality which he called al-Haq. Nothing exists on its own. Nothing has being of its own. All of it borrows its existence, moment by moment, from the one source of all existence, the way images borrow their appearance from light without ever becoming the light itself. Imagine standing in front of a hall lined entirely with mirrors, and in the center of that hall stands a single candle. Every mirror in that hall now shows a flame. Walk around the room and you will count hundreds of flames, thousands, depending on how many mirrors surround you. But how many actual flames are there? One. Only one. Every other flame you see is a reflection, an image, entirely dependent on that single source, possessing no independent light of its own. If you were to somehow blow out the true candle, every single reflected flame in every mirror would vanish instantly, because they never had their own existence to begin with. This, according to Ibn Arabi, is the exact structure of the entire universe. God is the single candle. Every created thing, every atom, every soul, every star, is a mirror reflecting some portion of that single divine light. The eye of the heart, when it is finally polished, sees through the reflections directly to the source. It sees the mirrors for what they actually are, not denying that they exist as reflections, but no longer mistaking the reflection for something independent, something separate, something that could exist on its own apart from the light that gives it its very appearance of being. This is precisely why Ibn Arabi so often described the goal of the spiritual path not as gaining new information, but as a kind of remembering, a return to something the soul already knew before it was clothed in a body. He drew heavily on the Quranic account of the primordial covenant, the moment before creation when every human soul was gathered and asked, "Am I not your Lord?" And every soul answered, "Yes, we bear witness." According to this teaching, the deepest core of every human being already carries the memory of that moment, already knows the truth of the one reality behind all forms. The problem is not ignorance in the sense of never having known. The problem is forgetting, hafla, heedlessness, the slow drowning of that original knowledge under the noise of worldly life. Marifah, true gnosis, true spiritual knowing, is therefore not the acquisition of something new from outside. It is an unveiling of something that was buried within all along. This distinction matters enormously, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. There are two Arabic words that are often both translated into English as knowledge, ilm and marifah, and Ibn Arabi drew a sharp line between them. Ilm is knowledge acquired through study, through books, through the intellect processing information, and drawing conclusions. It is valuable. Ibn Arabi himself was one of the most prolific and learned authors in the history of Islamic civilization, producing hundreds of works, some say over 300, covering law, theology, cosmology, and poetry. But ilm, no matter how vast, remains knowledge about something. It is knowledge from a distance, knowledge held by the mind the way a hand holds a stone, external to itself, examined, turned over, analyzed. Marifah is entirely different. Marifah is knowledge by union, knowledge by direct tasting. What the Sufis call doq, taste. You can read 1,000 books describing the flavor of honey, memorize every chemical compound that produces its sweetness, and still know absolutely nothing compared to the person who has simply placed a drop of honey on their tongue. Marifah is that drop on the tongue. It is knowledge that arrives not through the intellect, analyzing from outside, but through the heart's direct, unmediated contact with the reality it perceives. This is why Ibn Arabi so often emphasized that the eye of the heart cannot be opened purely through study, no matter how brilliant the student. He respected the scholars, he was one of them, but he insisted, sometimes to their great irritation, that the highest knowledge was reserved for those who combined rigorous learning with lived spiritual practice, with sincere devotion, with the difficult, humbling work of purifying the self. He would say that the scholars who rely only on intellectual proof are like people describing the ocean from a book. while the true knowers, the Arifin, are like people who have actually been submerged in its waters, who have felt its currents pull at their own bodies, who have tasted its salt on their own lips. Both may use similar language to describe the ocean, but only one of them actually knows it. Now let us go deeper into what exactly this inner eye perceives once it truly opens, because this is where Ibn Arabi's teaching becomes almost unbearably vast in its scope. He described a realm that exists between the purely physical world we perceive with our five senses and the purely spiritual, formless world of divine realities that exceeds all human comprehension. He called this intermediate realm the Alam al-Khayal, the world of imagination, though this should not be confused with imagination in the modern sense of mere fantasy or invention. For Ibn Arabi, imagination in this technical sense was an entire ontological realm, a real dimension of existence, a barzakh, an isthmus, a meeting place where spiritual meanings clothe themselves in forms so that they can be perceived by beings like us, who are neither purely spiritual nor purely material, but composed of both. Think of your dreams. When you dream, you often perceive things that feel completely real, vivid colors, tangible textures, conversations you can hear, and yet none of it exists in the physical world in the way a table or a chair exists. And yet it is not simply nothing either, because the images in your dream can carry real meaning, real guidance, sometimes real warnings that later prove true. Ibn Arabi took the reality of the dream state extremely seriously, and he taught that the world of imagination he described was, in a sense, the same realm dreams draw from, except that advanced knowers of God could access this realm not only while asleep, but while fully awake, in states of vision he called mushahada, direct witnessing. In these states, spiritual realities that have no shape in themselves would appear to the opened eye of the heart clothed in forms, sometimes as light, sometimes as figures, sometimes as words spoken without any physical mouth producing the sound. He gave his own life as evidence of this. He described, in remarkable detail, an encounter that took place near the Kaaba in Mecca, where he says he met a mysterious youth, radiant and luminous, who seemed to embody within a single form all the sacred knowledge scattered across the entire universe. This youth, he explained, was not simply a human being he happened to run into. It was, in the language of the tradition, a theophany, a self-disclosure of divine reality taking on a form perceivable to the opened inner eye. It was during his time in Mecca that Ibn Arabi began writing what would become one of his most towering works, the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, the Meccan Openings or Meccan Revelations, a title that itself reveals everything about his method. These were not compositions he sat down and planned with an outline the way an ordinary author would. They were openings, futuhat, sudden inrushes of understanding that arrived, he claimed, directly from the unseen. And his task was simply to receive them faithfully and set them into words. However imperfectly human language could capture what was shown to him, it is worth pausing here to address something honestly. Because a reasonable person listening to all this might wonder whether Ibn Arabi was simply describing hallucination, or the product of an unusually vivid imagination in the ordinary sense of the word. This question was raised in his own lifetime, and it continued to be raised by critics for centuries afterward. Some jurists condemned him outright, accusing him of blurring the line between the creator and creation, of teaching a kind of pantheism that dissolved the distinction between God and the world in a way that seemed to contradict the strict monotheism at the heart of Islamic teaching. His books were banned in some regions, burned in others, and to this day scholars remain divided, some regarding him as the single greatest mystic in the history of the tradition, others regarding significant parts of his teaching as dangerous, potentially misleading for anyone without the proper spiritual foundation to understand it correctly. It matters that we hold both of these realities in mind, the reverence and the controversy, because it is precisely the boldness of his claims that makes his teaching so significant and so worthy of careful, honest engagement rather than blind acceptance or dismissive rejection. Ibn Arabi himself, to his credit, repeatedly warned that his teachings on the unity of being were not meant to collapse the distinction between the creator and the creation into a simple sameness, the way a careless reading might suggest. He was extremely precise about this, even if the precision is easy to miss. He taught that al-Haq, the ultimate reality, remains utterly transcendent, beyond all comparison, beyond all limitation, exactly as orthodox theology insists. And at the same time, this same reality is immanent, present, disclosing itself continuously through every single form in existence, without ever becoming contained or limited by any of those forms. The mirror reflects the flame. The reflection is not the flame itself, and yet the reflection has no light of its own apart from the flame. Both truths, transcendence and immanence, had to be held together, And Ibn Arabi accused those who denied either half of the equation of falling into error, either into a hollow deism that pushed God infinitely far away and severed the living connection between the Creator and creation, or into a crude pantheism that flattened the majesty of the divine into the mere sum of created things. His actual position was far more subtle than either extreme, and this subtlety is precisely what generations of readers have struggled to fully grasp, and what many critics, reading only fragments out of context, have failed to appreciate. Let us move now toward another central pillar of his teaching, one that connects directly back to the opening of the inner eye, and that is his doctrine of al-Insan al-Kamil, the perfect human, or the complete human being. Ibn Arabi taught that among all the countless mirrors reflecting the divine reality throughout creation, one type of mirror has the unique capacity to reflect not merely a single divine attribute, the way a mountain might reflect majesty, or a flowing river might reflect gentleness, but the totality of all divine names is at once, in perfect balance. This is the human being, but not the human being in their ordinary unpolished state. This is the human being who has undergone the complete process of purification, who has polished the mirror of their heart so thoroughly that it reflects the divine reality in its fullness, holding within themselves the perfect balance of majesty and beauty, severity and mercy, transcendence and nearness. He considered the prophets, and above all the final prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, to be the supreme, complete manifestation of this perfect human reality throughout history. But he did not limit this station to the prophets alone. He taught that every human being carries within themselves the potential to actualize this same perfection, because every human being, at the deepest level of their being, is created upon the very form the divine reality intends to be reflected through. This is why, in his cosmology, the human being occupies such an extraordinarily elevated position, far above the angels, who each reflect only a single quality without deviation, obedient and beautiful but limited. The human being, uniquely among all creation, carries the capacity to reflect everything, precisely because the human being was fashioned, according to the well-known prophetic tradition he frequently cited, upon the form of the divine names themselves. But here is the catch, and it is the same catch we encountered earlier with the dusty mirror. This potential remains only potential unless the inner eye is opened and the heart is polished. Most human beings live their entire lives never actualizing even a fraction of what they were created to reflect, distracted, heedless, absorbed entirely in the passing concerns of the outer world, mistaking the mirrors around them for independent realities, rather than recognizing them as fleeting reflections of something infinitely greater. Ibn Arabi did not see this as a condemnation. He saw it as an immense, almost unbearable tragedy. The tragedy of a being created to carry the fullness of divine reflection, wandering through life believing itself to be nothing more than flesh and bone, appetite and fear, birth and death. So how, practically, does a person move from the state of forgetting toward the state of the perfect human, toward the full opening of the inner eye? We touched earlier on dhikr and on detachment from lesser loves. But Ibn Arabi added several more dimensions to this path that deserve careful attention, because they reveal just how psychologically sophisticated his teaching truly was, centuries before the modern language of psychology even existed. The first of these is the confrontation with the nafs, usually translated as the ego or the lower self. Ibn Arabi, following the Quranic description, spoke of the nafs as passing through different stages. In its lowest state, it is the nafs al-amara, the soul that commands toward evil, driven entirely by base appetite, by anger, by the endless hunger for pleasure and status, utterly blind to anything beyond its own immediate gratification. Most human beings, he taught, spend the majority of their lives governed by this lowest self without ever seriously questioning its demands. It whispers constantly, and because it whispers from inside our own mind, using our own inner voice, we mistake its commands for our own authentic will, when in fact it is closer to a kind of internal tyrant that has seized control of the throne that rightfully belongs to the heart. Through consistent spiritual struggle, what the tradition calls mujahada, a person begins to gain some distance from this tyrant. They begin to notice its whispers rather than blindly obeying them. This marks the movement into what is called the nafs al-lawama, the self-reproaching soul, the stage where a person still falls into error, still succumbs to lower impulses at times, but now possesses an inner witness that recognizes the fall, that feels remorse, that turns back. This stage, uncomfortable as it is actually a sign of tremendous progress, because it means the eye of the heart has begun to open even slightly, enough to observe the nafs rather than being completely fused with it. Ibn Arabi taught that this stage of self-reproach, though painful, should never be despised. because the very discomfort of it is evidence that the light has begun entering the room, revealing dust that was always there but simply could not be seen before in total darkness. With sustained practice, with sincere devotion, with the guidance of a qualified spiritual master, a sheikh who has themselves traveled this road and can recognize the specific obstacles facing each individual student, a person may eventually arrive at what is called the nafs al-mutmainna, the soul at peace, the tranquil self, described beautifully in the Quran as the soul that returns to its Lord well-pleased and well-pleasing. At this stage, the lower impulses have not necessarily vanished entirely. Ibn Arabi was far too honest a psychologist to promise a complete erasure of human nature. But they no longer rule. The heart has become the master of the house once again, and the appetites that once commanded now serve, properly ordered, properly balanced, no longer capable of clouding the mirror the way they once did. It is worth emphasizing something here, because modern audiences sometimes assume that mystical traditions like this one demand a kind of harsh world-denying asceticism, a rejection of the body, of pleasure, of ordinary human life. Ibn Arabi actually pushed back strongly against this assumption. He was, famously, a married man, a father, someone who did not retreat entirely from society into isolated caves the way some ascetics did. He taught that the goal was not the annihilation of the self in some final sense of ceasing to exist, nor the abandonment of worldly life altogether, but rather the proper ordering of the self, so that the body and its legitimate needs became instruments of the polished heart, rather than obstacles competing against it. He often criticized excessive asceticism practiced for its own sake, or for the sake of spiritual pride, as being just as much a veil as excessive indulgence, because both, done wrongly, keep a person's attention fixed on themselves, on their own effort, their own achievement, their own image, rather than on the reality the heart is meant to reflect. This brings us to perhaps the most beautiful, and certainly the most famous, dimension of Ibn Arabi's entire teaching, the role of love, ishq, as the true engine that drives the opening of the inner eye. He is remembered, among many other things, as one of the greatest mystical poets in Islamic history, and his most famous collection of poetry, known as the Interpreter of Desires, describes an intense, overwhelming love for a woman he encountered during his pilgrimage, a learned and beautiful young woman, whose presence stirred in him a love so consuming that later scholars, uncomfortable with such raw language of longing appearing in a work by so revered a spiritual master, accused him of writing merely secular love poetry unfit for a man of his stature. Ibn Arabi's response is itself one of the most important statements in the entire history of mystical literature. He wrote an entire commentary explaining, verse by verse, how every image of longing, every description of physical beauty, every ache of separation in those poems was simultaneously and inseparably a description of the soul's longing for the divine reality itself. For him, there was no ultimate contradiction between human love, rightly experienced, and divine love. Human love, when it does not collapse into mere possession or mere appetite, becomes a doorway, a training ground, a living metaphor through which the heart learns the grammar of longing it will eventually direct toward the source of all beauty itself. He often spoke of a station he called the religion of love, describing his own heart in one of his most quoted lines as having become capable of every form: a pasture for gazelles, a monastery for monks, a temple for idols, the Kaaba for the pilgrim, the tablets of the Torah, and the scrolls of the Quran, all at once, following the religion of love wherever its caravan may turn, because love, he insisted, is his true religion and his true faith. This was not, as some later critics assumed, a rejection of the specific religious form he practiced throughout his life. Ibn Arabi remained a devoted practitioner of Islamic law and ritual until his final days. Rather, it was an assertion that the heart which has been truly opened, truly polished, comes to recognize the same single reality shining through every sincere form of devotion, in every tradition, wherever human beings turn toward the sacred with genuine love, precisely because, as we discussed earlier, every form in existence is a mirror reflecting the same single light, and the opened eye of the heart, no longer confused by the surface differences between mirrors, sees straight through to the one flame reflected in all of them. This is an extraordinarily bold claim, and it is one of the reasons Ibn Arabi remains such a magnetic and controversial figure across so many centuries and so many cultures, drawing fascination not only from within the Islamic tradition, but from students of mysticism, philosophy, and comparative religion the world over. It is important to understand what he was and was not saying. He was not teaching that all religions are simply interchangeable, that doctrine does not matter, that a person can pick and choose beliefs at random, without discipline or commitment. He remained, throughout his entire life, rigorously committed to Islamic practice and law. What he was describing was something that happens at the level of the opened heart. At the level of direct mystical perception, a station reached only after extensive purification, where the veils of form fall away and the underlying unity becomes directly visible, not as an intellectual theory but as a lived, tasted certainty. He was careful, in his more legally and theologically focused writings, to insist that ordinary believers, and even most advanced seekers, should remain firmly grounded in the specific practices and laws of their tradition, because the outer form is not an obstacle to be discarded but the very vessel, the very training ground, through which the inner eye is gradually opened in the first place. You do not throw away the ladder because you have glimpsed the roof. You climb it carefully, one rung at a time, and only those who have genuinely reached the top have any business speaking about what the view looks like from up there. Before we move toward the practical, I want to take you deeper into one more piece of this architecture, because without it the entire teaching remains incomplete, and that piece is the doctrine of the divine names, Al-Azma Al-Husna, the most beautiful names. Ibn Arabi taught that Al-Haq, the ultimate reality, possesses countless names, countless qualities, and that creation itself exists for no other reason than to serve as the field upon which these names could be displayed, witnessed, and known. Think about a name like the Merciful. Mercy, as a pure quality with nothing to act upon, remains an abstraction, a concept without a stage. For mercy to become visible, to become real in any experiential sense, there must be a being capable of receiving mercy, a being who can be forgiven, comforted, healed, sustained. The same is true for a name like the Just, which requires a field in which justice can be enacted and witnessed, or the name the Provider, which requires beings with genuine need, or the name the Subtle, which requires hidden intricacies capable of being noticed by an attentive eye. Ibn Arabi taught that the entire cosmos, in its staggering diversity, exists as the necessary theater for the full display of these names, and that every single created thing, without exception, is the specific locus, the specific mirror, through which one or more of these names becomes visible. This is precisely why he insisted that nothing in existence is meaningless, however small, however seemingly insignificant. The particular curve of a leaf, the particular cruelty of a tyrant, the particular tenderness of a mother, the particular ferocity of a storm, all of it, every last detail, is a name of the divine reality finding its mirror, its stage, its moment of disclosure. He used the word tajali for this, self-disclosure. And he taught that the universe is not a static finished object, but a living, continuous unfolding of tajaliyat, self-disclosures, occurring in every instant, never repeating in exactly the same form twice. In fact, this is one of his most startling philosophical claims, one that echoes forward across the centuries into later discussions of time and process. He taught that no single thing in existence remains in the same state for two consecutive moments. Existence itself is renewed at every instant, continuously created anew, so that what appears to our ordinary senses as a stable, continuous world is, to the opened eye of the heart, an endless cascade of fresh divine disclosure, moment dissolving into moment, form dissolving into form, each one a fresh mirror catching the same eternal light in a slightly different angle. Now, if every single thing in creation is a mirror for some name, some quality, then it follows that the human being, uniquely capable, as we discussed, of reflecting the totality of these names at once rather than merely one or two, occupies an extraordinary position in this entire cosmic display. Ibn Arabi described the human being as the polished mirror placed at the very center of the ring, the point through which the divine reality becomes fully self-aware within creation, the way a person only truly sees their own face when a mirror is placed before them. In one of his boldest formulations, he suggested that the entire purpose of creation itself, echoing a saying attributed to the divine in the broader tradition, "I was a hidden treasure and I loved to be known, therefore I created the world so that I might be known," could only be fully realized through the human being, because only the human heart, once polished, is capable of the kind of comprehensive knowing this saying describes. This means, quite staggeringly, that your own inner awakening, your own opening of the eye of the heart, is not merely a private matter of personal enlightenment. It is, in some very real sense within this cosmology, part of the very purpose for which existence itself was set into motion. Let me tell you a story now, one that Ibn Arabi returned to often in his writings, because it illustrates everything we have discussed so far in a single, unforgettable narrative, the story of Moses and the mysterious figure the Quran calls simply al-Khidr, though his name is never actually spoken in the text itself. Moses, a prophet, a man who spoke directly with the divine reality, a man of towering knowledge and unshakable law, is told that there exists a servant of God possessing a form of knowledge Moses himself does not have. Moses, in his humility, sets out on a long journey to find this figure and asks to accompany him, to learn from him. And what follows is one of the strangest and most instructive episodes in the entire Quran. Khidr agrees to let Moses accompany him only on the condition that Moses ask no questions about anything he witnesses, no matter how disturbing it might appear. Moses agrees, and almost immediately fails to keep his word. Khidr damages a boat belonging to poor fishermen, seemingly an act of senseless destruction, and Moses cannot contain himself. He objects immediately. Later, Khidr kills a young boy with no apparent provocation, an act that horrifies Moses so deeply that he objects again, more forcefully this time, unable to reconcile what he is witnessing with everything he understands about justice and mercy. And then, in a village that had refused them even basic hospitality, Khidr repairs a crumbling wall for no payment at all, and Moses, exhausted and bewildered, objects a third time, unable to understand why such generosity would be shown to people who had shown them none. At this point, Khidr explains, and this explanation is the entire reason Ibn Arabi loved this story so much. The boat was damaged deliberately to make it appear worthless, so that a tyrannical king, seizing every seaworthy vessel in the region, would pass over it, sparing the livelihood of the poor fishermen who owned it. The boy, Khidr explains, was destined to grow into a source of immense grief and corruption for his righteous parents, and his early death, terrible as it appeared, was a mercy that spared them a far greater sorrow and replaced him, in time, with a better child. The wall, repaired without payment, concealed a buried treasure beneath it belonging to two orphaned boys in the village, and it needed to remain standing, hidden, until they came of age and could claim it themselves, a mercy shown to them, despite the cruelty of the villagers who surrounded them. Ibn Arabi used this story to illustrate, with unmatched clarity, the exact difference between ordinary knowledge, even the towering prophetic knowledge possessed by a figure as great as Moses, and the deeper knowledge available only to the fully opened eye of the heart. Moses possessed the law, the outer sight, the capacity to judge events by their apparent visible surface, and by that surface alone, every single one of Khidr's actions appeared unjust, even monstrous. Khidr possessed something else entirely, a form of perception that saw not merely the event unfolding in front of him, but the entire hidden web of causes and consequences threading invisibly through time, the mercy folded inside apparent cruelty, the protection folded inside apparent loss. This, Ibn Arabi taught, is precisely what the opened inner eye grants a person, not superior moral character necessarily, not even superior law, but a deeper register of perception, capable of glimpsing the hidden wisdom threading through events that, viewed only from the outside, appear senseless, unjust, even devastating. How many times he would ask his students, have you looked at some terrible turn in your own life, some loss, some door slammed shut in your face, and judged it entirely by its bitter surface? Never once suspecting that a Khidr-like mercy might be folded invisibly into its depths, waiting for years, sometimes decades, before its hidden purpose finally became clear. This naturally leads us into two more terms absolutely essential to understanding the full journey of the inner eye, terms that describe the furthest reaches of the path Ibn Arabi mapped out: fana and baqa, annihilation and subsistence. As the heart is polished, as the layers of dust are gradually removed through remembrance, through detachment, through the confrontation with the nafs, a point is eventually reached where the sense of a separate, independent self, the very thing insisting all along that it is the center of its own private universe, begins to dissolve. This dissolving is what the tradition calls fana, often translated as annihilation, though this translation frightens people more than it should. Ibn Arabi was careful to clarify that fana does not mean the literal ceasing to exist of the individual person. It means, rather, the annihilation of the illusion of independent existence, the collapse of the false belief that the self possesses being of its own, separate from the single source of all being we discussed earlier, through the image of the mirrors and the candle. In the state of fana, the individual mirror, so to speak, becomes so perfectly polished, so utterly transparent, that it no longer asserts any distinct identity of its own. It simply reflects, without distortion, without interference, the light passing through it. And yet, Ibn Arabi insisted, fana alone was not the final station. And here he distinguished himself from some other mystics of his era, who seemed to treat annihilation as the ultimate goal in itself, the final disappearance into undifferentiated unity. He taught instead that true completion involves a return, what the tradition calls baqa, subsistence or abiding. After the false self has been annihilated, After the illusion of independent existence has collapsed, the individual does not simply vanish forever into an undifferentiated blankness. They return, but they return transformed, subsisting now not through their former illusory sense of independent selfhood, but through the very reality that had always sustained them, seen now clearly, consciously, directly, for the very first time. This is the state of the perfect human we discussed earlier, fully actualized, someone who walks through the ordinary world, eats, sleeps, works, laughs, grieves exactly as any other person does, and yet whose inner eye remains permanently open, whose heart remains a perfectly polished mirror, reflecting the divine reality in every single moment, in every single encounter, without a single layer of dust remaining to distort the image. I want to pause here and offer an honest warning, because Ibn Arabi himself offered this same warning repeatedly throughout his writings, and it would be irresponsible to leave it out. The path toward the opening of the inner eye is not free of danger. And one of the greatest dangers on this path has nothing to do with external forces at all. It comes from within, from the very ego the path is designed to dissolve. Ibn Arabi warned again and again about the trap of spiritual pride, the moment when a seeker, having tasted some genuine opening, some real glimpse beyond the veil, begins to believe that this glimpse makes them superior to others, begins to perform their spirituality for an audience, begins to seek the reputation of being an advanced knower rather than seeking the reality itself. This trap, he taught, is in some ways more dangerous than ordinary worldly ambition, precisely because it disguises itself in sacred language, precisely because it can convince a person that their ego is dissolving even while that same ego quietly repositions itself at the very center of the spiritual journey, now feeding on subtler, more sophisticated forms of pride than it ever managed on the level of ordinary worldly life. The eye of the heart, he warned, can glimpse something real and still remain underneath that glimpse, entangled with layers of dust the seeker has not yet learned to recognize as dust at all, because they have taken on such a convincing pious disguise. This is precisely why the tradition places such enormous weight on humility, sincerity, and the guidance of someone further along the road, because self-deception on this path can be remarkably sophisticated, and a person walking entirely alone, relying only on their own private interpretation of their own private experiences, is exceptionally vulnerable to mistaking the flattering whispers of a subtle ego for the genuine unveiling of the heart. Ibn Arabi himself, despite the towering scope of his own claimed unveilings, remained, according to those who studied his life closely, a man of remarkable humility in his daily conduct, insistent that his students verify everything he taught against the Quran, against the practice of the Prophet, against sound reasoning, refusing to ask for blind acceptance of even his most extraordinary claims. Knowledge received through unveiling, he taught, still had to be tested, still had to be held with humility rather than certainty, still had to be offered to others not as a demand for belief, but as an invitation, gentle and patient, toward their own direct tasting of the same reality. Let us return now to the very practical question that any sincere listener must eventually ask, which is, what does this actually mean for someone living an ordinary life today, someone who is not a medieval mystic, who has bills to pay, relationships to maintain, work to complete, a mind constantly pulled in 100 directions by notifications and obligations and worries about tomorrow? Does any of this ancient teaching about the polished mirror of the heart have anything real to offer a person like this? Or is it simply a beautiful relic of a distant and very different world? Ibn Arabi himself would insist, without hesitation, that this teaching is more urgent now than it has ever been, precisely because the conditions of modern life are so remarkably effective at keeping the mirror of the heart covered in dust. Consider how much of daily existence is now structured around capturing and holding the attention of the outer senses, the eyes and the ears, feeding them a constant stream of images, sounds, and stimulation specifically engineered to prevent a single moment of genuine stillness. Ibn Arabi taught that the inner eye can only open in the presence of a certain quality of attention, a quality that requires moments of genuine quiet, genuine withdrawal from the noise of the outer world, even if only for a few minutes at a time. He called this practice khalwa, spiritual retreat or seclusion, not necessarily a dramatic withdrawal into a cave for 40 days, though such intensive practices existed within the tradition, but at minimum, a regular, disciplined carving out of time in which the senses are quieted, the outer noise is silenced, and the heart is given the chance to simply be still, to simply listen to itself. Perhaps for the first time in a very long while, he also taught the practice of muraqabah, vigilant watchfulness, the continuous gentle awareness of being seen, being witnessed, at every single moment, by the reality that never stops observing. This is not meant to produce anxiety or paranoia. Quite the opposite. Ibn Arabi described this awareness as ultimately the source of the deepest peace a human being can experience. Because once a person genuinely internalizes the truth that they are always held, always witnessed, always accompanied by the very source of existence itself, the desperate, exhausting need to constantly seek validation and reassurance from the outer world, from other people's opinions, from status, from achievement, begins to loosen its grip. The heart, no longer starving for attention from lesser sources, becomes free to turn its attention toward the one source capable of actually satisfying it. There is a further practice Ibn Arabi placed enormous weight upon, one that connects directly to the story of Moses and Khidr we just explored, and that is the practice of contemplation, tafakkur, turning the polished portion of the heart toward the created world itself and reading it as a living text, a scripture written not in ink but in mountains and rivers, in the turning of the seasons, in the quiet architecture of a single flower. He taught that the physical world was never meant to be an obstacle, standing between the seeker and the divine reality, a mere distraction to be escaped or transcended. Rather, rightly perceived, the created world becomes the single greatest teacher available to the opened eye, because every single form within it, as we discussed, is a mirror for some divine name. A seeker who has begun the work of polishing their heart can walk through an ordinary garden and find themselves overwhelmed, not by the beauty of the garden in some vague sentimental sense, but by the direct perception of the specific names being disclosed there. The name the fashioner in the intricate structure of a single petal, the name the generous in the abundance of fruit offered freely, without any need for repayment. The name the living in the sheer, unstoppable insistence of growth, pushing up through soil and stone. This is why Ibn Arabi so often insisted that the spiritual path was not a rejection of the world, but a transformation of how the world is seen. Nothing about the outer form of a person's daily life necessarily needs to change for this transformation to occur. The same walk to work, the same conversation with a neighbor, the same meal shared with family, becomes, to the opened eye, an entirely different experience, charged with meaning, alive with disclosure, rich with a presence that was always there, but simply could not be perceived before the dust was cleared away. He described advanced knowers of God who could sit in an ordinary marketplace, surrounded by noise and haggling, and the mundane business of buying and selling, and remain at the very same moment in a state of continuous inner witnessing, utterly undistracted from the reality unfolding within their own heart, proving decisively that this path did not require withdrawal from ordinary human life, only a fundamental shift in where and how attention rested even in the midst of that life. There is also the matter of company, of surrounding oneself, whenever possible, with people whose hearts are further along this path. People whose very presence acts like a kind of polish upon one's own heart. Ibn Arabi placed enormous importance on the relationship between a student and a qualified guide, someone who has already traveled the road and can therefore see obstacles in the student's heart that the student themselves cannot yet perceive. This is one of the most consistent themes across the entire history of Sufi teaching. The warning against attempting the journey entirely alone, entirely through books, entirely through one's own private interpretation, without any accountability, without any living connection to someone who has walked further along the same road. The heart is remarkably skilled at deceiving itself, at mistaking its own desires for divine guidance, at mistaking spiritual pride for spiritual progress, and a guide serves as a mirror in their own right, reflecting back to the student what the student cannot yet see in themselves. And beneath all of these specific practices lies something even more fundamental, something Ibn Arabi returned to again and again throughout his enormous body of work, and that is sincerity, ikhlas. He taught that the entire path could be summarized in the effort to do everything, every act of worship, every act of kindness, every moment of remembrance, purely for the sake of the reality being reflected, rather than for the sake of being seen as pious, rather than for the sake of feeling spiritually accomplished, rather than for any hidden motive of self-interest whatsoever. This sincerity, he taught, is itself one of the most powerful forms of polish that can be applied to the mirror of the heart, because insincerity, even subtle insincerity, even the kind a person barely notices in themselves, immediately reintroduces a layer of self-concern, a layer of ego, precisely the substance the entire path is designed to dissolve. Now, having laid out so much of the structure of this teaching, I want to bring us back to where we began, to that image of the eye that has never blinked, open since before you were born. Because underneath all of the metaphysics, all of the poetry, all of the centuries of commentary and controversy, Ibn Arabi's entire teaching rests on a single breathtakingly simple claim. You are not separate from the reality you have spent your whole life searching for. The very organ needed to perceive it is already installed within your own chest. You did not misplace it somewhere far away. You simply stopped looking inward, and the layers of a distracted, forgetful life settled over it like dust settling over a mirror left uncovered in a busy room. Nothing about this process requires you to become someone else, to acquire some exotic new identity, to travel to some distant place. It requires instead kind of return, a homecoming, a slow and patient turning of attention back toward the one place you never actually left, because that inner reality has been with you watching, waiting utterly undiminished, every single second of your entire life. There is one final thread I want to pull before we close, because it addresses a question that inevitably arises whenever this teaching is presented to a modern audience. If this inner eye, this capacity for direct perception of ultimate reality, has always been present within every human being, why did it take a figure as extraordinary as Ibn Arabi, backed by an entire civilization's worth of accumulated spiritual practice and scholarship, to map it out in such detail? Why is this not simply common knowledge, taught openly to every child the way arithmetic or language is taught? Ibn Arabi actually addressed this question directly, and his answer reveals something important about the nature of the teaching itself. He taught that this knowledge cannot be transmitted the way ordinary information is transmitted, through simple explanation alone, because the very organ needed to receive it, the eye of the heart, is precisely what remains veiled in the person attempting to learn about it. You cannot describe color to someone who has never possessed sight in any capacity and expect them to actually see the color through your description alone. At best, they will form an intellectual concept of what you mean, a shadow of the real thing, useful perhaps as a starting point, but categorically different from the direct perception itself. This is why the tradition surrounding Ibn Arabi's teaching, and Sufi teaching generally, developed such an elaborate structure of practice, discipline, and personal guidance alongside the theoretical writings. The books alone, however brilliant, however vast, could only ever point toward the door. They could describe, in exquisite and sometimes overwhelming detail, what lies beyond it. They could offer maps drawn by those who had already walked through, but the actual walking, the actual polishing of the individual heart standing before that door, remained and remains an intensely personal undertaking, unable to be shortcut through reading alone, however much reading might inspire and orient a sincere seeker toward beginning the work in the first place. This is precisely why so much of the transmission of this knowledge, historically, occurred hand to hand, heart to heart, through the living relationship between a teacher whose own heart had been substantially polished and a student willing to submit humbly and patiently to years of guided practice, correction, and inner work. And this raises one more point worth addressing honestly, because it would be dishonest to present this teaching as though it were universally accepted without complication across the history of Islamic thought. We touched earlier on the controversy surrounding Ibn Arabi's doctrine of the unity of being, and it deserves a bit more context here. Prominent scholars across the centuries, including some of considerable standing within various schools of Islamic law and theology, expressed serious reservations about aspects of his teaching, worried that language describing the created world as a mirror or reflection of the divine reality could be misunderstood, whether by careless readers or by those seeking to justify their own errors, as license to treat the boundary between creator and creation as dissolved altogether, opening the door to claims of personal divinity, or to an abandonment of religious obligation on the grounds that all distinctions had become, in some ultimate sense, illusory. Other scholars, equally learned, equally respected within their own circles, rose to Ibn Arabi's defense, arguing that his critics had frequently misread him, extracting striking phrases from their proper context within an enormously vast and carefully balanced body of work, and that Ibn Arabi's own explicit statements about the absolute transcendence of the divine reality, statements we discussed earlier through the image of the flame and its reflections, made clear that his teaching, properly understood, posed no actual threat to the foundational distinction between creator and creation that the tradition holds as essential. This debate has never been fully settled, and it likely never will be, precisely because Ibn Arabi's language operates at such a rarefied altitude of abstraction that it resists easy paraphrase, inviting each generation of readers to wrestle with it anew, according to their own capacity, their own state, their own opened or unopened eye. What can be said with confidence, regardless of where any individual reader ultimately lands in that centuries-old debate, is that Ibn Arabi succeeded in doing something remarkably few thinkers in any tradition have managed to do. He built a complete, internally coherent architecture, connecting the most abstract metaphysical questions about the nature of existence itself, down through the structure of the cosmos, down through the psychology of the human self with all its layers and struggles, down to the most intimate, practical question of what a single human being ought to do, today, this very hour, to move even slightly closer to genuine inner clarity. Few teachings in the history of human thought manage to hold together the cosmic and the intimate with such consistency, allowing a reader to move within the space of a single work, from contemplating the structure of the entire universe to examining the precise quality of sincerity behind their own most recent private thought, and to feel, throughout that entire movement, that both scales of reflection are describing the very same single reality. Simply viewed from different distances, Ibn Arabi died in the year 1240 in Damascus, having produced a body of work so vast, so intricate, that scholars are still discovering new dimensions of it today, nearly 8 centuries later. His tomb in Damascus remains a place of pilgrimage, visited by people from every corner of the world who continue to feel drawn to the teaching he left behind, a teaching that refuses to stay confined within any single tradition, any single century, any single culture, precisely because it speaks to something universal in the human condition itself, the ache of separation, and the promise that the separation, however real it feels in the midst of ordinary life, is not the final or the deepest truth about who and what we actually are. Think for a moment about how rare that combination actually is in your own experience. How many teachers have you encountered, in any field, who could speak with total confidence about the largest possible questions, the nature of reality, the structure of the cosmos, and then, without any loss of coherence, turn immediately to something as small and specific as the quality of your own attention in this very instant, the sincerity behind your last decision, the layer of dust settling right now invisibly over your own particular mirror. This is the gift Ibn Arabi left behind, not merely a philosophy to be admired from a comfortable distance, but a mirror held up to each individual reader, inviting them to stop reading about the eye of the heart in the abstract and start asking, quite personally, quite uncomfortably, whether their own eye remains shut, and if so, what exactly has been placed over it, and by whom and for how long, and what it might take, starting today, to begin wiping even the smallest corner of it clean. So let me leave you with the same question the eye of the heart has been quietly asking you this entire time, whether or not you have noticed. What would change in your life, in this very moment, if you truly believed that the ultimate reality you have been seeking was never far away, never hidden behind some locked door in a distant heaven, but was in fact reflected, right now, in the very depths of your own chest, waiting only for the dust to be gently, patiently, lovingly wiped away? Ibn Arabi spent his entire life trying to answer that question, not only with words but with the way he lived, and he left the answer as an inheritance for anyone willing to do the quiet, unglamorous work of turning their attention inward, day after day until the mirror begins to shine again, and the eye that never blinked finally opens and sees.